You're just a housewife, Mom. Please don't embarrass us tonight. My son Daniel said those words so casually that for a moment I thought I must have misheard him. The restaurant around us was bright and elegant, the kind of place with soft piano music and crystal glasses that caught the light from the chandeliers above. Daniel had invited me to celebrate his promotion, a dinner he called a small family evening, though when I arrived I realized it was much bigger than that. His colleagues filled the long table, along with their spouses, and Rachel, my daughter-in-law, sat beside him in a pale blue dress that matched the linen napkins perfectly. She smiled politely when I sat down, but it was the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. I had worn my best cardigan, the cream-colored one I saved for holidays, and I remember smoothing the sleeves while everyone talked about quarterly reports, medical conferences, and investment opportunities. Most of the conversation moved quickly over my head, but that never bothered me. For 35 years my life had been centered around quieter things, packing school lunches, sewing Halloween costumes, and keeping a small house warm enough for a boy who used to run through the front door shouting, "Mom, I'm starving." Back then Daniel would drop his backpack in the hallway and tell me everything about his day before he even took off his shoes. I never imagined there would come a day when he would speak to me like I was a stranger sitting at the wrong table. At first I tried to laugh off his remark. I even reached for my water glass and took a slow sip, hoping the conversation would move on. But Rachel leaned slightly toward him, her voice soft enough that she probably thought I wouldn't hear. "Daniel just means you don't need to worry about the business talk," she said lightly. "You should just relax and enjoy dinner." Relax. Enjoy dinner. The words sounded pleasant, but something about them carried a quiet dismissal, as if my entire life could be reduced to background noise. I watched Daniel nod as if what she said made perfect sense. He didn't look at me. Not once. Instead he turned back to the guests and began describing his new role at the hospital administration office, explaining how his department would oversee multiple research partnerships across the state. Everyone seemed impressed. I was proud too, of course. I had always been proud of Daniel. Even when he was a boy studying late at the kitchen table while I washed dishes, I could see how determined he was. I worked 2 part-time jobs back then, one at a grocery store during the day and another cleaning offices in the evenings, so he could focus on school without worrying about tuition someday. But none of those memories belonged at that table tonight. At least that's how it felt when Rachel laughed and said, "Daniel worked so hard to get here." Not everyone understands how demanding his world is. A few of the guests nodded politely. Someone asked what I used to do before retirement. I hesitated for just a second too long, and Daniel answered for me. "My mom stayed home most of the time," he said with a small shrug. "She was basically a housewife." Basically a housewife. The phrase settled over the table like a thin layer of frost. No one meant to be cruel. I could see that in their faces. But I also saw something else, an assumption forming, quiet and invisible. A picture of who I must be. Someone ordinary. Someone simple. Someone who didn't quite belong among discussions about research grants and hospital boards. I folded my napkin carefully and placed it beside my plate. The pianist shifted into a slower melody near the bar, and for a moment I focused on the music instead of the conversation around me. It reminded me of evenings years ago when Daniel practiced spelling words at the kitchen table while I hummed old songs from the radio. Back then he used to say my humming helped him concentrate. Funny how small things like that stay with you long after everything else changes. Rachel reached for her wine glass and raised it slightly, signaling the beginning of a toast for Daniel's promotion. Glasses lifted around the table, and I followed along quietly, though my hand felt strangely light, as if the glass might slip right through my fingers. "To Daniel," Rachel said with a bright smile. "And to the future he's building." Everyone echoed the toast. Daniel thanked them, standing briefly as people applauded. When he sat down again he finally looked toward me, but the glance was quick, almost distracted. I realized then that something fundamental had shifted. In the space between us. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough to make me feel like a visitor in the life I once helped build. I told myself it didn't matter. Titles never defined a person. I had known that for decades. Still, when Daniel's words repeated in my mind, just a housewife, I couldn't help noticing how quiet my side of the table had become. And that was exactly when the restaurant door opened and someone stepped inside who would change the entire evening with a single question. The restaurant door opened quietly, the soft chime above it barely noticeable over the piano music and the low murmur of conversations, but the man who stepped inside did not belong to the gentle rhythm of the evening the way the rest of us did. He walked with a sense of purpose, scanning the room as though he was looking for someone very specific. And I remember noticing him because he paused near the entrance and looked around carefully before his eyes settled on our table, his expression changing in a way that was difficult to describe, not surprise exactly, but recognition, as if he had just spotted someone he had not expected to see again after many years. Meanwhile, the conversation at our table continued without interruption. Rachel was explaining something about a charity gala she and Daniel planned to attend the following month. And Daniel was laughing politely at a joke one of his colleagues had made about hospital budgets and late-night meetings. I kept my hands folded beside my plate and listened to the music drifting through the room, the quiet notes of the piano blending with the clinking of glasses and the faint scent of roasted salmon from the kitchen, and for a moment I allowed myself to believe that the evening would continue exactly like that, ordinary and distant, until the man began walking toward us. At first none of the others noticed him approaching, but I did. Because with every step he took something about his face began to feel familiar, not in the way you recognize a neighbor at the grocery store, but in the deeper way memory sometimes returns unexpectedly, like an old photograph you suddenly find in the back of a drawer. I could not place him yet, but something inside me stirred with quiet curiosity. He stopped beside our table and stood there for a brief moment, as if confirming that he had not made a mistake. Daniel noticed him first and looked slightly confused, assuming perhaps that this was someone looking for a different reservation. Rachel glanced up next and politely moved her chair an inch closer to the table to make room for the server she expected might arrive with another tray of drinks, but instead the man spoke, his voice calm but filled with unmistakable surprise. "Mrs. Collins," he said slowly, and the sound of my name carried across the table in a way that made every conversation pause for a second. I lifted my eyes to him and felt the strange sensation of recognition beginning to sharpen. The lines around his face suggested years of long workdays and responsibility, and the white coat folded over his arm hinted at a profession that carried both pressure and purpose. He looked at me carefully as if confirming a memory that had lived in his mind for a very long time, and then he said the words that shifted the entire atmosphere around our table. "Is that really you, Mrs. Collins?" The question seemed to float in the air between us, and several of Daniel's colleagues turned their heads with curiosity. Daniel himself looked mildly irritated by the interruption, as if someone had just stepped into a private meeting without an invitation. I searched the man's face again and slowly the memory arrived. Faint at first and then unmistakably clear. A young student sitting at a hospital waiting area. Many years ago, exhausted, anxious, and uncertain about his future. I had not seen him since those days, but something about the kindness in his eyes had not changed. "Dr. Walker," I said quietly, and the moment the name left my mouth his expression softened into a warm smile of relief. "I knew it was you," he replied, stepping closer to the table. "I was not sure at first, but I would recognize you anywhere." Rachel glanced between us with a puzzled expression while Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, clearly trying to understand how a doctor he did not know had suddenly become part of our dinner conversation. "I apologize for interrupting," Dr. Walker said politely to the group, "but when I saw Mrs. Collins I could not simply walk away." He looked at me again with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "It has been so many years, and I have often wondered where life had taken you." Daniel cleared his throat and offered a brief nod, attempting to regain control of the conversation. "Do you know my mother?" he asked with a tone that suggested he expected a simple answer and a quick return to the evening celebration. Dr. Walker turned toward him and smiled. "Know her?" he repeated gently. "I would not be standing here today if it were not for her." The table grew quiet in a way that felt very different from before. This was no longer the quiet of polite disinterest. It was the quiet of curiosity. Rachel lowered her glass slowly while one of Daniel's colleagues leaned forward slightly, clearly intrigued by the unexpected statement. Daniel frowned faintly as though trying to reconcile the woman he had just described as a housewife with the idea that a respected doctor might owe his career to her presence in his life, and I felt the strange shift in the room, subtle but undeniable. The evening that had begun with dismissal and quiet embarrassment had suddenly taken a direction no one at the table had anticipated, and Dr. Walker looked back at me with the same gratitude I remembered from long ago and said softly, "Mrs. Collins, I have been hoping for years that I might have the chance to thank you properly." Dr. Walker's words settled over the table like a quiet ripple moving across still water, and for a few seconds no one spoke. The gentle music from the piano continued near the bar, but it felt distant now, as if the entire room had paused to listen to something none of us had expected to hear that evening. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair and gave a short polite laugh. The kind people use when they are not certain whether something is a joke or a misunderstanding. "I am sure you must have." "The wrong person," he said, glancing toward me briefly before looking back at the doctor. "My mother never worked in medicine. She was mostly at home while I was growing up." Rachel nodded softly beside him as if confirming the statement, her smile returning though it carried a hint of curiosity now. Dr. Walker did not react with embarrassment or confusion. Instead he looked at Daniel with a calm expression. That suggested he had heard this kind of assumption before. "I understand why you might think that," he said gently, "but I remember very clearly who helped me during the most difficult year of my life." He turned his attention back to me and there was warmth in his voice when he continued speaking. "Mrs. Collins used to volunteer at St. Matthew Hospital many years ago, back when I was still a struggling medical student trying to decide whether I had the strength to continue my studies." The memory returned to me in a quiet wave. The long corridors of that hospital, the faint smell of disinfectant and coffee from the small staff lounge, the endless hours I spent helping where I could while Daniel was in school. I never thought of it as anything important. I simply believed that when someone was struggling you offered what kindness you could. Dr. Walker rested his hands lightly on the back of the empty chair beside our table as he spoke. "During my second year of medical school my father lost his job and my tuition became impossible to manage. I was preparing to leave the program because I believed there was no other option, and then one afternoon Mrs. Collins found me sitting in the hospital cafeteria staring at a stack of unpaid tuition letters." Several of Daniel's colleagues leaned forward slightly, listening more closely now. Rachel's polite smile had faded into quiet curiosity. Daniel remained still but his eyes had narrowed slightly as he tried to understand where the story was leading. Dr. Walker continued calmly, "Your mother did not know me well. We had only spoken a few times while I studied during my hospital rotations, but she noticed something was wrong and asked if I wanted to talk. I told her everything because at that moment I felt completely defeated. I expected sympathy and perhaps a few kind words, but instead she did something I have never forgotten." He paused for a moment and looked directly at me again. "You told me that sometimes the future of a person depends on a single moment when someone else decides to believe in them." "I remember those words exactly," he said softly. The table remained silent. The earlier laughter and business conversations had disappeared entirely. Daniel's colleagues exchanged brief glances with one another while Rachel slowly placed her glass back on the table without drinking. Dr. Walker continued speaking in the same calm tone. "Mrs. Collins introduced me to a small community scholarship program that helped students who had fallen into unexpected financial trouble. She spent several evenings helping me gather the paperwork and write the application letters. She even stayed late at the hospital office after her volunteer shift ended just to make sure I did not miss the deadline." He gave a small thoughtful smile. "That scholarship covered my tuition for the remainder of that year and allowed me to complete my training. Without it I would have left medical school and none of the patients I have treated in the last 20 years would have ever met me as their doctor." The weight of those words seemed to shift the atmosphere around the table again, this time not with curiosity but with something deeper. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair as if trying to reassemble the picture of his own past that had always seemed so simple to him. Rachel looked from Dr. Walker to me with an expression that was no longer dismissive but thoughtful, and I simply sat there quietly because the truth was that I had never told Daniel about those evenings at the hospital or the students I had helped along the way. I never believed those small acts were worth mentioning. Dr. Walker straightened slightly and looked at Daniel again. "So when I saw Mrs. Collins sitting here tonight I could not walk past without saying hello," he said respectfully, "because to me she was never just a housewife. She was someone who quietly changed the direction of another person's life without ever asking for recognition." And for the first time since the dinner had begun Daniel looked at me with an expression that was no longer confident or dismissive but uncertain, as if he had just discovered there were entire chapters of his mother's life that he had never taken the time to read. Daniel did not speak immediately after Dr. Walker finished explaining, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had been said earlier that evening. The restaurant was still full of quiet music and distant conversations from other tables, but around us the atmosphere had changed completely. Daniel slowly placed his hands together in front of him as if he needed a moment to think. Before responding, Rachel glanced at him with a small uncertain smile that no longer carried the confident tone she had shown earlier. One of Daniel's colleagues cleared his throat softly and leaned back in his chair, clearly unsure whether this moment was part of the celebration or something much more personal. Dr. Walker remained standing beside the table with the same calm expression, not proud and not defensive, simply patient, as if he had told the truth and was willing to allow the room time to absorb it. Daniel finally spoke, but his voice sounded different now, quieter and slower than before. "I did not know about any of that," he said while looking at me with an expression that seemed to search for confirmation. I offered a small gentle smile because there was nothing dramatic to confirm. Those evenings at St. Matthew Hospital had never felt like a story worth telling. They were simply moments in life when someone needed help and I happened to be nearby. Rachel tilted her head slightly and spoke carefully. "You volunteered at a hospital for years and never mentioned it?" she asked. I shrugged lightly and folded my hands in my lap. "It was not a job that needed to be announced," I said calmly. "It was just something I did after Daniel finished his homework each night." Dr. Walker nodded with quiet understanding. "She was there almost every evening for several years," he added respectfully, "helping organize supplies, assisting families in the waiting room, and sometimes simply listening when someone needed encouragement." He turned to Daniel again with a thoughtful expression. "Many of the nurses used to say that Mrs. Collins brought a kind of calm to the hospital corridors that no training program could teach." Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment and stared at the tablecloth as if he was trying to place these new details into a memory that suddenly felt incomplete. The son who believed he knew his mother completely was now realizing there were entire parts of her life he had never paused long enough to see. Rachel reached for her glass again, but this time she did not drink. She simply held it loosely while studying me with a quieter expression than before. Dr. Walker continued speaking gently. "I know you may think these are small things, Mrs. Collins, but they were not small to the people who needed them," he said. "I remember one night when a young family arrived at the hospital terrified about their child's surgery. Everyone was rushing through the hallway and the parents were overwhelmed. You sat with them for nearly an hour explaining every step of the process in the calmest voice I have ever heard. By the time the surgeon came out to speak with them, they were no longer panicking. They trusted that everything would be all right." I remembered that evening faintly now that he mentioned it, the frightened parents, the paper cups of coffee we shared while waiting for news, the quiet relief when the doctor finally stepped out with a reassuring smile. Those moments had blended together over the years like soft pieces of an old photograph. Dr. Walker looked around the table briefly before continuing. "I eventually completed my residency and began practicing medicine," he said. "But I never forgot where my determination came from during those difficult years. There were times when I considered giving up, yet I always remembered the way Mrs. Collins believed in people without asking anything in return. That belief carried me through more than one exhausting night shift." One of Daniel's colleagues nodded slowly as he listened, clearly impressed by the story unfolding in front of him. Another guest offered a quiet remark about how rare it was to meet someone who had quietly supported so many others without seeking recognition. Daniel finally lifted his eyes again, and this time his expression was no longer confused but reflective, as if the image of his mother had shifted in a way he had not expected. Rachel placed her glass gently back on the table and offered a small thoughtful smile that felt far more genuine than the earlier one she had worn. Dr. Walker adjusted the folded white coat in his arm and said softly, "I do not wish to interrupt your celebration any longer. I only wanted the chance to say thank you properly after all these years." He turned toward me again with quiet sincerity. "Mrs. Collins, your kindness did more than help one student remain in school. It shaped the kind of doctor I chose to become." And before anyone at the table could respond, he added one final thought in a tone filled with respect. "Some people build careers that everyone can see, but others build something even more important. They build the courage and compassion that allows those careers to exist in the first place." And tonight I was reminded that behind every title there may be a quiet person whose influence is far greater than the world ever notices. Dr. Walker's words lingered in the air even after he finished speaking, and for a moment none of us moved. The restaurant around us continued with its quiet rhythm of soft music and distant conversations, but our table had become something entirely different from the celebration it had been only minutes earlier. Daniel slowly rubbed his hands together as if trying to organize his thoughts. His eyes moved from Dr. Walker back to me and then toward the tablecloth again. The confidence he had carried earlier in the evening had softened into something far more uncertain. Rachel sat quietly beside him with a thoughtful expression that seemed to replace the easy certainty she had shown when the night began. One of Daniel's colleagues finally broke the silence with a polite comment about how remarkable it was to hear such a story unfold unexpectedly. Another guest nodded and added that it was rare to meet someone who had quietly influenced the lives of others without ever speaking about it. Dr. Walker smiled politely at the table, but his attention returned to me again with the same respectful warmth he had shown since he arrived. "I hope you do not mind me sharing those memories," he said gently, "but there are moments in life when gratitude should not remain unspoken." I shook my head softly and offered a calm smile because I truly did not mind. Those years at the hospital had always been filled with small moments that mattered more to others than they ever seemed to matter to me. Daniel cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly in his chair. "Mom," he said slowly, "why did you never tell me about any of this?" His voice carried genuine curiosity now rather than dismissal. I considered the question for a moment before answering. "Sometimes the things we do quietly feel less like achievements and more like simple responsibilities," I said calmly. "When someone needs help you give what you can and then you move on with your life. There was never a reason to turn those moments into stories." Rachel watched me carefully as if trying to understand a version of me she had never imagined before. She finally spoke in a softer voice than earlier. "Daniel always said you preferred a simple life," she said. I smiled gently because that part had always been true. "A simple life does not mean an empty one," I replied. "Sometimes it simply means the important things happen in places that do not attract attention." Dr. Walker nodded thoughtfully and glanced around the table again. The people seated there had begun to listen with genuine interest now rather than polite obligation. Daniel's earlier description of me as a housewife seemed to hang quietly in the background of the conversation, no longer a complete explanation of who I was. Daniel leaned back again and exhaled slowly as if realizing that the story of his own childhood might contain more details than he had ever noticed. "I remember you being tired sometimes when I was younger," he said thoughtfully. "You used to come home late on certain nights and I thought you were just visiting friends." I smiled softly at the memory because it was easier for a young boy to understand that explanation than the truth about long evenings spent helping strangers in hospital waiting rooms. "Those nights were simply part of life," I said. "You had homework to finish and dreams to chase, and I was proud watching you focus on those things." Dr. Walker adjusted the white coat resting over his arm and spoke again with quiet sincerity. "Mrs. Collins never asked anyone to remember what she did at the hospital," he said to the table. "But many of us remember anyway because small acts of encouragement can shape the future in ways that titles and promotions cannot measure." Rachel lowered her eyes for a moment as if reflecting on those words. Daniel looked toward me again, and this time his expression held something deeper than curiosity. It carried the first hint of reflection about how easily people can overlook the quiet parts of someone else's life. The waiter approached briefly to refill glasses and the gentle clink of crystal returned to the table, but the mood had shifted permanently now. The earlier atmosphere of celebration had become something more thoughtful. Daniel finally spoke again with a calmer voice. "I suppose there are many things about people we never take the time to ask about," he said slowly, "and sometimes those are the most important parts." Dr. Walker gave a respectful nod and offered a final warm smile toward me. "I should return to my table before my colleagues wonder where I disappeared to," he said politely, "but I am grateful that fate allowed me to recognize you tonight, because some debts of gratitude deserve to be spoken aloud at least once in a lifetime." He paused briefly before adding one more sentence that settled quietly across the table. "And for what it is worth, Mrs. Collins, the medical students I mentor today often ask what inspires a person to stay compassionate in such a demanding profession. And every time they ask that question I remember the quiet volunteer who once sat beside a frightened student in a hospital cafeteria and reminded him that the future can change when someone chooses to believe in you." Dr. Walker gave one final respectful nod before stepping away from our table and returning to the group he had originally arrived with. And although the restaurant quickly resumed its usual rhythm of quiet conversation and clinking glasses, the atmosphere around our table had changed in a way that could not be undone. Daniel watched the doctor walk away with a thoughtful expression that seemed heavier than anything he had carried earlier that evening. Rachel followed his gaze for a moment before slowly turning back toward me. Her posture no longer held the confident ease she had displayed when the dinner first began. Instead, there was a careful stillness in the way she folded her hands together on the table, as if she was reconsidering everything she thought she knew about the person sitting across from her. Daniel finally exhaled slowly and leaned back in his chair. The soft restaurant lighting reflected in his glass as he lifted it absent-mindedly but did not take a sip. "I cannot believe I never knew any of that," he said quietly while looking at the table rather than directly at me. The tone of his voice carried genuine confusion now rather than embarrassment. I offered a calm smile because his reaction did not surprise me. People often believe they understand the lives of those closest to them simply because they share the same home or the same family name. But every person carries chapters that remain unseen unless someone takes the time to ask. There were many years when you were focused on school and building your career, I said gently. Those were the years that mattered most for your future. Rachel glanced at Daniel briefly and then looked toward me again with a thoughtful expression that seemed to soften the sharp edges of her earlier confidence. I suppose we all make assumptions about people without realizing it, she said carefully. I nodded slightly because that observation felt honest rather than defensive. Assumptions are comfortable because they allow us to stop asking questions, I replied calmly. But life is usually more complicated than the labels we place on one another. One of Daniel's colleagues who had been quietly listening throughout the conversation finally leaned forward with interest and spoke in a respectful tone. Mrs. Collins, if you do not mind me asking, how long did you volunteer at St. Matthew Hospital? The question carried genuine curiosity rather than politeness, and for the first time that evening I noticed the attention of several guests around the table focused directly on me. I thought for a moment before answering because time has a way of blending together when memories grow older. It must have been close to 8 years, I said slowly. I began shortly after Daniel entered high school and continued until he left for college. During those years the hospital became a second home in many ways. The late evening shifts, the quiet hallways, the families waiting anxiously for news, those experiences taught me more about patience and compassion than any book ever could. Daniel listened closely now, his earlier certainty replaced by the quiet curiosity of someone realizing there were entire seasons of life he had overlooked. You used to come home late on Tuesdays and Thursdays, he said thoughtfully as if a memory had just surfaced. I remember you always warmed up soup for both of us before I went to bed. I smiled softly because the memory returned clearly in my own mind. The small kitchen light glowing late at night, the 2 bowls of soup on the table, the quiet satisfaction of knowing he was safe at home while I returned from helping others. Those were simple evenings but they mattered deeply at the time. Rachel rested her chin lightly on her hand while listening. The earlier tension in her voice had disappeared and was replaced with something closer to reflection. I suppose there are many ways people contribute to the world that never appear on a resume, she said quietly. That is very true, one of Daniel's colleagues replied before I could answer. Some of the most important influences in our lives come from people who never receive titles or public recognition. Daniel slowly turned his attention back toward me and for the first time since the dinner began his eyes held something that looked almost like humility. I should have asked more questions over the years, he said quietly. Perhaps, I answered gently. But life moves quickly when someone is building a career and a family. What matters is the present moment and the choices we make now. The waiter returned with the main course plates and placed them carefully in front of each guest. The soft aroma of roasted vegetables and grilled salmon filled the air as the conversation gradually resumed around the table. Yet the tone of that conversation had shifted in a subtle but unmistakable way. Daniel's colleague spoke to me directly now rather than politely around me, asking about the hospital years and the people I had met there. Rachel listened with thoughtful silence, and Daniel remained quiet for a long moment before finally saying something that carried far more sincerity than any remark he had made earlier that night. Mom, he said slowly, I think there are many things about you that I never took the time to truly understand. Daniel's words remained hanging between us for a moment after he said them, and the sincerity in his voice carried a weight that had been missing earlier that evening. The music from the piano continued softly near the bar and the rest of the restaurant carried on with its normal rhythm. But our table felt different now, quieter and more reflective. Daniel rested his elbows lightly on the edge of the table and looked at me with an expression that reminded me of the young boy who once asked endless questions at the kitchen counter while finishing his homework. Rachel watched him carefully and then turned toward me again with a calm and thoughtful look that seemed far removed from the confident tone she had used at the beginning of the dinner. One of Daniel's colleagues leaned back slightly in his chair and said with a respectful smile that it was rare to hear such stories because most people spend their lives talking about achievements rather than the quiet moments that make those achievements possible. I nodded politely because I understood what he meant. Although I had never thought of those hospital evenings as achievements of any kind, they had simply been part of the rhythm of life during those years when Daniel was growing up and the world seemed filled with both responsibilities and possibilities. Daniel took a slow breath and looked toward the table for a moment before speaking again. I remember those nights now, he said quietly. You used to come home carrying that old canvas bag with your notebook and a stack of papers. I used to think you were bringing work home from a book club or something like that. I smiled softly because the memory was so clear in my mind. The bag had contained volunteer schedules, donation forms, and sometimes letters from families who needed help navigating the hospital system. It was easier to tell a child that I was helping with community projects than to explain the complicated emotions of hospital waiting rooms. Rachel listened carefully and then spoke with a gentle tone that held genuine curiosity. Did you ever consider working at the hospital full-time? She asked. The question made me pause for a moment because the answer carried memories of choices that had shaped the direction of my life many years ago. I did consider it once, I said calmly, but Daniel was still young at the time and I believe my most important responsibility was making sure he had the stability he needed to grow into the person he wanted to become. Sometimes the best decisions in life are the ones that leave space for someone else's future. Daniel lowered his eyes slightly when he heard that and rested his hands together again. One of his colleagues spoke with quiet admiration. That kind of sacrifice is something many people overlook. He said thoughtfully, careers often receive recognition but the support behind those careers rarely does. Rachel nodded slowly as if those words had settled into her thoughts as well. The waiter returned briefly to clear a few plates and refill glasses, and although the dinner continued in the polite way social gatherings often do, the tone of every conversation at our table had shifted towards something more personal and reflective. Daniel finally lifted his eyes toward me again and there was a new seriousness in his voice when he spoke. Mom, I think I owe you an apology for something I said earlier tonight. The guests around the table grew quiet once more, not in the uncomfortable silence that had filled the air earlier but in the respectful stillness that appears when someone chooses honesty over pride. I tilted my head slightly and waited because apologies are often more meaningful when they arrive in their own time. Daniel continued, speaking slowly, when I said that you were just a housewife I thought I was making a simple description of your life. But now I realize I was reducing your entire story to a single label without ever understanding what that story truly contained. Rachel glanced at him with a look that showed she had not expected such direct words. Daniel kept his eyes on me as he finished the thought. And I am beginning to understand that the person I believed I knew completely might actually be someone far more remarkable than I ever realized. I felt a gentle warmth in my chest when I heard those words because they carried the kind of recognition that no title or public praise could replace. Sometimes the most meaningful moments between family members are the quiet realizations that arrive after years of ordinary life. I placed my hand lightly on the table and offered him the same calm smile I had given him when he was a child learning from his mistakes. Life is not about proving who is important and who is not, I said gently. It is about learning to see one another clearly even when the world encourages us to look only at titles and accomplishments. Daniel nodded slowly as if those words had reached a deeper part of his understanding. Rachel's expression softened as she listened, and the evening that had begun with a careless remark had quietly transformed into something far more meaningful than anyone at that table could have predicted when the first toast had been raised. Daniel's apology did not disappear quickly from the air around the table. It lingered in the quiet space between us the way meaningful words often do when they arrive later than they should but still carry genuine truth. The guests who had been listening respectfully began to return slowly to their meals, yet the tone of every movement remained softer and more thoughtful than before. The earlier energy of celebration had been replaced by something calmer and more reflective. Daniel remained still for several seconds after speaking as if he was allowing his own words to settle in his mind. Rachel watched him carefully and then looked toward me with an expression that was no longer guarded but quietly sincere. The candlelight on the table flickered gently against the glasses and silverware. And for the first time that evening the dinner actually felt peaceful. Daniel eventually leaned forward slightly and rested his hands together. Mom, he said again in a voice that carried both humility and curiosity. There are many things about those years that I clearly did not understand. I used to think I knew exactly what your life looked like, but now it feels as if I only saw a very small part of it. I listened without interrupting because understanding often grows best in moments when people allow themselves to reflect aloud. Rachel nodded slowly beside him and added in a calm voice that carried genuine thoughtfulness. Sometimes people assume that a quiet life means a simple life. But tonight has shown me that quiet lives can contain stories that are far deeper than we imagine. I smiled gently at her words because they felt honest rather than polite. The waiter approached briefly to clear the last plates from the table and refill the glasses with water, and the soft sound of dishes being moved reminded everyone that the evening was still continuing despite the unexpected turn the conversation had taken. One of Daniel's colleagues spoke again with a respectful tone and said that in his experience the people who leave the strongest influence in the world are often those who never seek recognition at all. Daniel nodded slowly when he heard that and then looked back toward me. I think I spent many years focusing on the idea that success is something visible, he said thoughtfully, promotions, titles, achievements that everyone can see and measure. But tonight I am beginning to understand that some of the most meaningful work happens quietly, in ways that do not appear on any resume. Rachel placed her hand gently on the table and added softly that the hospital story had changed the way she thought about the word housewife, she said. That earlier she had believed the word described someone whose life revolved only around a home, but now she realized that a home can be the center from which kindness spreads into many other places. I appreciated her honesty because it is never easy for people to admit that their perspective has changed. Daniel took a slow breath and allowed a small thoughtful smile to appear. I suppose it is ironic that the evening meant to celebrate my career ended up teaching me more about yours, he said. Quietly, I shook my head gently because the lesson did not belong to me alone. Life teaches all of us eventually that titles are only a small part of a person's story. What truly matters is the way we treat others while we are building those titles. The music from the piano drifted toward our table again and the conversation gradually resumed among the guests, yet the sense of reflection remained present. Daniel's colleagues began asking quieter questions about the hospital years and the people I had met during that time. Rachel listened attentively while occasionally adding thoughtful comments of her own. Daniel remained mostly silent for a while as if he was revisiting memories from his childhood with new understanding. Finally he looked at me again and spoke with a tone that was calmer and warmer than any he had used earlier in the evening. Mom, I think I understand something now that I never realized before, he said slowly. The success I am celebrating tonight did not begin when I received my promotion. It began years ago in a small kitchen where you helped me with my homework and in hospital corridors where you encouraged people who felt afraid. Those moments may not have looked impressive to the outside world, but they shaped the person I eventually became. The words carried a quiet sincerity that made the entire table pause again for a brief moment. Rachel looked at him with a gentle smile and one of his colleagues nodded thoughtfully as if recognizing the truth in what he had said. I simply returned Daniel's gaze with a calm expression because the recognition in his voice was more valuable than any apology. Sometimes understanding arrives slowly in life, but when it does it changes the way we see everything that came before. Daniel's words remained with me long after he finished speaking, not because they were dramatic or loud but because they carried the quiet weight of understanding that had taken many years to arrive. The candlelight flickered gently between us while the music from the piano continued in the background. And for the first time that evening the room felt calm in a way that had nothing to do with celebration and everything to do with reflection. Daniel rested his hands on the table and looked at me with an expression that reminded me of the thoughtful young man he had once been when he was trying to understand the world beyond our small home. Rachel sat beside him with a soft and respectful expression. Her earlier confidence had transformed into something more thoughtful. One of Daniel's colleagues raised his glass slightly and said that moments like this were rare because they reminded people that success is rarely the result of one person alone. Another guest nodded in agreement and added that many of the most meaningful influences in life are the ones that remain invisible to the outside world. Daniel listened to those comments quietly and then looked back toward me with a small smile that held both humility and warmth. Mom, he said slowly, I think tonight may have been one of the most important lessons I have received in many years. I used to believe that the most impressive stories were the ones people talked about openly, promotions, achievements, things that appear in newspapers or professional announcements, but now I understand that the stories that shape us most are often the ones that happen quietly when no one is watching. Rachel nodded gently and added that the evening had changed the way she thought about many things as well. She admitted that earlier she had viewed my life through a very narrow description. But hearing about the hospital years and the people whose lives had been touched during that time made her realize that compassion and influence are not measured by job titles. I listened to both of them with a calm sense of peace because the recognition in their voices was more meaningful than any explanation I could have offered earlier. Sometimes people must discover truth in their own time rather than being told it directly. The waiter returned to the table with dessert plates and the soft aroma of warm apple pastry filled the air. The conversation among the guests gradually became lighter again, but the sense of reflection remained present. Daniel finally leaned forward and spoke once more with quiet sincerity. Mom, I cannot change what I said earlier tonight, but I can promise that I will remember this moment for the rest of my life. I will remember that the person I once described with a single careless phrase has lived a life far richer and more meaningful than I ever stopped to imagine. I placed my hands gently together on the table and gave him a calm smile because forgiveness is easier when understanding has already begun to grow. Every life contains chapters that others may not see immediately. I said softly, what matters is that we learn to look beyond the surface before we decide who someone truly is. Rachel reached across the table and placed her hand lightly over Daniel's. Her gesture carried quiet agreement with those words. One of Daniel's colleagues lifted his glass again and suggested a final toast. Not to promotions or titles but to the unseen kindness that shapes the world in ways people often forget to notice. The glasses around the table rose slowly and the gentle clink of crystal echoed softly through the air. Daniel looked toward me once more before raising his own glass. This time there was no distance or embarrassment in his expression, only respect. And in that quiet moment I realized that the evening had given him something far more valuable than the celebration he had planned. It had given him the chance to see the person who had always been standing beside him with clearer eyes. The music continued to play, the candles burned lower, and the dinner that had begun with a careless remark ended with something far more lasting, a simple but powerful understanding that no one's life should ever be measured by a label when the true story behind it has not yet been heard.